Hey everybody, I see y'all are all joining us this morning. This is great. I'm going to go ahead. I'm Kevin Gumienny. I'm the Senior Learning Architect here at Microassist, and I will be talking with you today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And I'm going to turn off my video because sometimes it can be a little bit distracting when a video is going and you've got a screen going as well. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my video. Now I'm going to start screen sharing. And share screen. Okay. Now, so welcome everybody. It's a little bit after 11. I think we're going to kind of go ahead and get started. Just wanted to take a little bit of time to sort of introduce myself and discuss what we're going to be talking about here today. My name is Kevin Gumienny. That's so much better. I always enjoy presenting when I'm talking about this stuff. I just enjoy standing up and being able to walk around a little bit. So we're going to be talking about today in our webinar session about accessible online training. Now, the idea here is I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the talk a little bit about some of the issues with accessible training. I want to talk some about what accessibility is, how we might be able to use it, and I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the tools and techniques, mostly the techniques that you can use to incorporate it. The goal is really to have about 15, 20, 25 minutes at the end of this session for you guys to ask us questions that we can then respond to. So I'll tell you a couple of things. If you can put your questions in the chat area, I will not be looking at that chat because I just can't do two things at once as we're going through it. But I've got a colleague of mine, Dallas Richard, is keeping an eye on that chat. So if you have any technical questions or technical issues, go ahead and send him a note. You can also put your questions in there, and at the end of the session, we'll go through them. And I just want to let you know, like right up here at the beginning, that we will answer all of the questions. If we can't get to them today, because we run out of time or whatever, I'll post them up to, we've got a web page that we have hosted. We'll kind of share that. And then also you can reach out to me, as the screen here says, I'm the Senior Learning Architect. The company phone number is 512-794-8440. As I'm sure most of you are working, we're all working remotely, but if you call that number, your message will get to me, or you can use my email address, which is kgumienny@microassist.com. Now, before we sort of delve in, I wanted just to welcome everybody, say thank you for joining us today. I especially want to express our thanks to the Texas Department of Information Resources for being an education sponsor of today's webinar and helping us get the word out about what we're talking about today. We're excited to have so many of our neighbors from Texas state agencies, local government, and higher education joining in today. Now, I did want to note, you'll see an item on the bottom of the slide where it says EIR Accessibility Discussion List, and there's a website there. It's www.dir.texas.gov, www.dir.texas.gov. And if you're interested in joining a discussion list, DIR hosts a discussion list for those interested in EIR accessibility, electronic information resources for EIR. And if you're interested in subscribing, you can visit the DIR website and scroll down toward the lower left, click on Stay Connected, and then you'll see an index of the resources. So the list name is the PESO discussion list. However, it's about to be renamed the DIR Accessibility List. All members will remain subscribed. And just on a personal note, I've been a subscription to the PESO discussion list, soon to be the DIR accessibility list, for years, and it's just a tremendous resource for helpful information, not just for those of you in the state, for those of us in the state of Texas, but also just on accessibility in general. It's really, really great stuff. Okay, so accessibility and online training. Remember, any questions you have, any commentary you have, go ahead and post that in the chat. You'll notice that when I started, I read you the slide. And some of you are thinking, oh, well, what is he doing reading us this slide? Everybody tells us we're not supposed to read the slide. Here's the thing. If you're trying to reach all your learners, which you really should do, some of those learners might have visual disabilities. They might not be able to see what's on the screen. And so conveying the information, the important and significant information that you actually have in your PowerPoint slide is absolutely essential if you want people to access this information. Another thing that you might notice is down at the bottom, there are captions that are appearing. These are captions that are automatically generated by PowerPoint. So I'm on a Mac, but even on a Mac, if you're subscribed to Office 365, you can then have those on, and they'll automatically carry on. Now I noticed that somebody in the chat room says, ask, can I turn those off? And unfortunately, no. Those, when you're doing this style of presentation, those captions are generated automatically by PowerPoint, and they're being created as I speak. One of the downsides also of the PowerPoint chats, they're auto-generated, which means that they're going to have errors. And we have a lot. I mean, the technology is really great to do this, but it's not perfect yet. Another thing is that what often happens is if you're sharing a PowerPoint over Zoom, only the person who's actually sharing the PowerPoint, only their voice is going to be picked up and auto-captioned. But at the same time, it provides a way for those who may have hearing issues to read the captions, read what's going on. The other thing I love about this, and you'll hear me say this again and again, and as we continue to talk today, is solving for accessibility solves some things for so many other things. Now, I'm not going to argue that accessibility solves all your problems, and I'm not going to argue that there are not constraints when you deal with accessibility, when you're trying to design something so that it'll work with a screen reader, or design something so that it has sufficient color contrast so that somebody with low vision can perceive text against a background. They are constraints. But on the other side of it, it does help in so many other ways. Some of you may be, well, I used to say, when I've talked about this in the past, I've said some of you may be in a noisy office environment and neither have headphones nor, and you can't play your speakers, so captions help you see that. But of course, we're all working at home now, or a lot of us are working at home. And so if you're not in a noisy office environment, maybe the dogs are barking, the sound of my voice sets off your dogs just like crazy and nobody knows why, right? So you mute me, you have there. Another thing is, you could be watching this on a phone and maybe the text is so small that you can't see what's on the screen. And so reading the screen aloud helps in that situation as well. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about accessible online training. We're going to talk about training that's given live like we're doing right now in this webinar. And we're going to talk about training that we deliver later. Like if you click on the link to this webinar we're going to put up. What are some things that you need to think about accessibility there? So, hold on just a second. Let me get that slide advanced. Okay, so just to kind of set the stage a little bit, I'm sure you've been noticing the news. It's 6 months now, 6 months since the pandemic hit. So back in March, 6 months ago, everybody was thinking about, and I was thinking about, so how do we move our online training? We've got to go remote. We can't meet in person anymore. Classrooms, lecture halls, meeting rooms, conference rooms, they're not a thing anymore. So we need to move to remote. And then maybe from April to August, you get things figured out. That big initial rush is over. Things are making sense now. You're working out the kinks. Everybody knows how to use Zoom. Everybody knows to mute or unmute themselves. But then here comes September and you're thinking, wait a minute, do I have to make this accessible? Do I have to make this available to those with disabilities? And the short answer is yes. Many of you really need to do this. So before we get started, I do want to back up. I do want to make a specific note about what we mean with online training, because online training means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Like the image that I have up right now is these are just a bunch of generic images that just represent the basic ideas. And one of them's a picture of a PowerPoint. I'm sorry, a PDF page, right? So maybe downloading a PDF manual, because you can download it over the internet, or because you can pop open it in your web browser, that's online training. Maybe you've got a learning management system that you want to deploy. Maybe that's where your training is, and you've actually got things set up with activities and resources, and people sign into the learning management system and enroll in the class and take the class, and that's where your online training is. Maybe it's video. I love video. Video is great in a lot of ways. One, it's super responsive, right? So whether you're doing it in a lecture hall or on the side of a building with all of your learners in their cars just kind of watching it, you've got your video available, or it could be on your phone, right? So, and then also it's relatively easy, as long as you're paying attention to make video accessible. Get your captions, have your transcripts, make sure that if anything's going on in the video that's not being conveyed audibly, so people can hear it, you've added something called audio description, which basically just describes what's going on in the video. So video is really kind of good. It's cool. Or you might do something like, I do a lot of this training that's self-directed, it's on demand, it's developed in something like Storyline, or it's developed in something like Lectora or Captivate, these tools that are designed for people like me who, I do instructional design, I can do a little bit of development, but I am not a coder. But I can use this to create training that's interactive and engaging. And then finally, you might have something like a webinar or a classroom where you're training people all, what you would normally have done in a conference room, which would normally do in a classroom. Maybe all of those people are on a Zoom session and you're walking through them and you're answering questions and you're participating and you're doing all of this live in the moment. So this is how I tend to think about these things. And I would say, and this is nothing formal, it's nothing that's written down, well, except of course on my PowerPoint slide, but it is a way that I tend to think about this that helps me slot and get an idea of how I need to make things accessible. So I think in buckets, like one bucket is live training. It's like, what do I need to do when I'm doing something like I'm doing right now? Talking to y'all in person, and how this, working the way this works over Zoom. Right? It's in the moment. And then what do I need to do to make something accessible when it's later? These are two very different things. I've got captioning going, for my presentation here. But if I were to record this and deliver this as a video, I would also want to take a look at that, and I want to pull out and make a transcript so that somebody using assistive technology can quickly scan the transcript and find what was in there. So by moving it from live to later, it kind of changes the sort of technologies that you need and the ways that you need to think about to make something accessible to your users. So why do you need it? Why do something accessible at all? This is where I always start. Like in my head, when I'm thinking about doing any kind of online training, I want to make my training available to all my learners. 61.4 million Americans have a disability or report having a disability. That's more than 1 in 4. But something that's really important to realize is that not all disabilities are disclosed, they're not obvious, and not all of them are permanent. Right? So you're not always designing accessible training for thinking that, hey, I've got somebody who's completely blind and I need to design this training for them. Yes, you do. But you're also designing for those people who are, you can't see me take off my reading glasses and hold them up as an example, but for somebody who's using reading glasses who doesn't consider themselves as having a disability, but if they're trying to access your training on their phone and they left their reading glasses, they need to enlarge the text. Left their reading glasses elsewhere, they need to enlarge that text. You need to design to reach them. If you need to design to reach somebody who has a temporary disability, somebody who maybe broke both their arms, right? And they can't manipulate a mouse, they have to interact through voice interface. Somebody's a situational disability, like as we talked about in our no longer entirely relevant example, at least this moment in time, of being in a noisy office. And so when you design for accessibility, you're reaching all of their learners in all of your learners in as many ways as you can. Accessibility e-learning enables all employees, regardless of whether they report a disability, to reach their full potential, which allows organizations to function at a higher level overall. And let's not forget the law. I always want to pull people, right? Because we're in this business to help our learners become better at what they do. But there are reasons that legal pushes for us to do this, and also gives us standards to work with. So the American with Disabilities Act, Section 504 and 508 of the United States Rehabilitation Act, are two federal laws that pertain to online accessibility. American with Disabilities Act doesn't really talk about websites, doesn't talk about online training, but there have been a lot of court cases that are available to, that you can draw on, that have been drawn on, that sort of demonstrate that, hey, courts are looking at private organizations and saying, hey, you need to make this accessible. And it's not enough just to throw it up there. If you're an educational institution and you take $1 worth of federal money, you've got to make your electronic content accessible. If what we often hear about, Section 508, which is a federal procurement standard, it applies really to federal agencies, more so than just in general, but people use it as a shorthand to talk about accessibility. And what it means is that if you're a federal agency, any electronic information and communication technology that you create has to meet certain standards for accessibility. Any that you purchase has to meet certain standards for accessibility, and this includes online training. You also find that if you're an entity that's selling to a federal agency, then it also needs to meet Section 508 standards. And what you'll also find, for those of you joining us from Texas, is that the Texas Administrative Code incorporates Section 508 by reference. So when you're working for the state agencies in Texas, you need to make sure to do this. How do we know what's accessible? This is a screenshot of how to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, I'm not going to go into these in any detail. I kind of want to point you to them, let you know that they're out there. What we've seen is that Section 508 incorporated WCAG by reference a few years ago. And then when we're looking at resolution agreements, which are the kind of agreements that come between universities and other entities as a result of Department of Education actions, and when we look at court decisions coming out of the American with Disabilities Act, what we find is that these entities are referring to WCAG 2.0, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, as a general set of standards. What it does is it has a list of 60 or 70 success criteria, depending on how all these apply. And all the success criteria does is say, hey, if your web page does this, or if your training does this, if it has an image and you've got an alternative text for that image, then it meets this success criteria. Why might you want to do this? Well, if I'm using a screen reader as assistive technology, kind of going through this, and I'm looking to going through a page of online training, if I'm using a screen reader, if I'm blind, I'm not going to be able to see that there's an image. But I need to get the meaning of that image, so I put in what's called alternate text or alternative text, or shorthand alt text. And if I do that for an image, then it checks off that success criteria. So you'll hear a lot of, this is absolutely accurate. When we're talking about checklists when it comes to accessibility, there's kind of a checklist mentality, and that is problematic, right? Because if all I'm doing is checking the boxes, I'm not ensuring that the content is usable. I want to make sure that it can be used by somebody with disabilities, not necessarily that it's checking all of these boxes on WCAG. But at the same time, I find this really, really helpful, because I love using lists that allow me to kind of go down and just take the load off. It doesn't mean that it's successful if I do all these things, but it does mean that I'm hitting these major points. And then I still need to go test it with my users. It kind of lets you sort of offload a little bit of that thinking, a little bit of that memory, kind of just make sure that you're hitting all of these points when you use something like this. Okay, let's take a moment. Let's just take a little moment, because this is a lot, right? This is a lot. In the top of my screen, I've got a little Zen guy. He's in a Zen meditation pose, right? Because I think you kind of need to. And when I started working with accessibility, I was overwhelmed. And there's all this stuff you have to do. It's not enough just to have the right image. That I work with a lot of subject matter experts, right? So an image that makes my subject matter experts happy, that furthers the learning content. So it's not just eye candy, but it's actually meaningful, right? Let's not even get into copyright and all that kind of stuff. So I have to think about all of that. And now I have to think about alternate text for that image. Now I have to think about my color scheme and make sure that it has sufficient contrast. The text has sufficient contrast with the background. Now I've got to think about, can people go through this entire course just using the keyboard, not a mouse? Because somebody with a mobility disability might not be able to use a mouse. And somebody who's blind, if they're using a screen reader, they're not going to use a mouse, they're going to use the keyboard. All of this stuff is landing on my head, in addition to all the stuff I already do. And it is, in some ways, it's terrifying, right? Just the level that you need to do. But here's the flip side of it. Now that I've kind of set the stage and scared you a little, maybe the flip side of it is you're already doing so much of this stuff. I mean, all you trainers out there, I mean, you take so much time and effort to reach your learners. Right? You're not just lecturing at them, you're creating activities. You're studying the research and figuring out what helps make learning stick, what's going to be most meaningful and help people take the training in the classroom and adapt it to the workplace, transfer it to the workplace. All you training managers out there, you're making sure that everybody has everything that they need so they can get going and show up at the right place and on time. That the facility is good and decent, or that everybody has access to Zoom that they need, and that they know how to manipulate the tools, and that their speakers are working, and all this other kind of good stuff. Because you don't want somebody to get into training and be so focused on how to mute or unmute themselves that they pay attention to that and not to what actually is being taught. And accessibility is right in this vein. It's taking somebody who might have difficulty seeing and making sure that the font is large enough on your content. It's making sure that somebody who might be looking at a page of training on a phone can zoom in and see all of it. You're making, what accessibility does is accessibility makes training available to all your learners. And sure, there are reasons, there are laws and regulations to make it, to kind of push us to do this, and that's fine. But we're in this business to help our learners change behavior. We're in this business to help our learners become better at what they do. And accessibility, by making the training, by building on what you already do, you're able to reach all of your learners and make it successful. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about the details. I'm going to hit these kind of high level, but if there's anything in interest that kind of pops up, note the question in the chat and let us know what your questions are. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is live training. So this is kind of what I'm doing now, right? I'm talking to you, or if you're in a Zoom session and you're moderating a Zoom group, what are the things you need to think about? One is describe what you're doing. All right, so as you're going through your slides, if you are manipulating, if you're showing somebody how to use software, like a software training, describe what you're clicking on and what you're doing. Don't depend that people are going to be able to track where you're going. Open up this menu, kind of verbalize it and describe. One person speaks at a time. There are a lot of captioning solutions that allow you to have multiple people speaking, and the captioning software will do its best to distinguish between those, but it's just the old politeness rules, right? You just don't interrupt. Because somebody listening to this, if they hear overlapping voices, not just somebody who needs an accommodation for accessibility, but just in general, just your learners in general, the voice gets garbled and people can't make out what's being said. One person speaks at a time. Say your name every time you speak. So I introduce myself as Kevin. We haven't had a handover to another presenter, but if we did, that person would say their name. Why? Sometimes the captioning technology is good enough to pick up on those transitions. A lot of times it isn't. And also, if somebody's just reading captions, they're not going to be able to hear the change in voice. And also, I mean, I'm sure we've all been on those calls, right? Where you got like maybe 10 people on a meeting and they're like 2 people are absolutely certain that everybody knows what their voice sounds like. And so they talk, but they don't introduce themselves. And you're like, who the heck is talking? Right? And so just making this a habit kind of goes back to that principle. You make things accessible, you make things better for everybody. And then the final thing I would note here on in-person virtual training, on this live training, is to note accommodations. So I told you that we had auto captions going at the beginning, and I did that intentionally. I did it for a couple of reasons. And I saw a question a little bit earlier that talked about, that said, can I turn them off? Well, so you open yourself up to that possibility. So instead of somebody getting frustrated because they can't turn off the captions, they know that it's not currently an option. Right? People know, and also I mentioned that they were automatic captions. So if you see some errors in transcriptions, you know that those are there, you know kind of to expect them. If I'm reading my slides to you, this is the #1 feedback I get when I talk about this kind of subject is, especially when it comes to slides, we are told time and time again, never read your slides to everybody, right? Because you read slides on a screen, it just bores everybody. People can read the slides themselves. So I'm telling you, no, you need to read your slides. And then I'm reading boring slides to everybody, and then they're getting bored. But here's the thing: in my mind, it kind of goes back to the slide, right? It's not on you, it's not a read, it goes to slide design. Many years ago, a fellow named Gar Reynolds wrote a great book called Presentation Sin, and a lot of people have followed up on these concepts later. And the idea is basically that your slides are there to support you. Nobody's coming to see your slide deck. If they were, you can send them your slide deck, right? They're coming to see you and your expertise and what you have to share. So design slides that support you. My slides, you'll notice, have a little bit of branding and then a title and then just bullet points. My bullet points are things I would say anyway. So I don't really need to necessarily specifically say that I'm reading my slides. And I incorporate them into my flow, so I build off of this. So I think it becomes a matter of, can I design my slides to support what I'm saying, to make it so that, hey, it makes sense that I'm hitting the points on the slides, because those are important points that people need reinforcement with. Okay, documents. So okay, I'll tell you, my very first online course, I got that sucker perfect. It had to be accessible. It was beautiful. You can navigate through the whole screen. Let's see, it was a Lectora course. And you can navigate through the entire screen using the keyboard. Screen read everything fine. You could go up to the resources button. You could activate the resources button. And you can download the resources. What I neglected to do was make sure that my resources, which were PDFs, had actually been remediated for accessibility. You gotta think about your documents, your resources, and how are those going to be accessible. So consider accessibility when you're deciding on your format. If you're doing a PowerPoint presentation like this one, can you provide the PowerPoint slides? Would it make more sense if your training is encapsulated in like a Word document? Would it make more sense to use a Word document, or maybe convert that to a PDF? Which is going to be more accessible? How is that going to be more functional? And here's something else. So PowerPoints are actually most accessible when you provide the slide deck, not an output as a show. Because somebody who has access to a slide deck can go in and manipulate it so that they can access that information most easily. Sort of similar to, but if I provide you my slide deck, which I have, all of my content, you can pull it and use it wherever you want. That can be a security issue. If I'm sending out a PDF, if I've secured that PDF, locked it down, that's great for security. Nobody can copy it, nobody can print it, for example. But now a screen reader can't access it. So there are trade-offs when it comes to this. I mentioned constraints. This is one of the constraints. And it might be that you have to figure out a way to navigate. If your agency is saying, you gotta lock all your PowerPoints, you gotta lock all your PDFs before you make them available to the public. How do you do that and still maintain accessibility? Sometimes there's no easy option. Sometimes you have to make compromises. But the thing is to think about those, is to think about where you can push to make things more accessible. Does this really need to be locked for printing? Somebody can, if somebody really wanted this content, they could take a picture of the PDF on the screen. They could type it out and transcribe it, right? So are there ways to work around that? Check accessibility before you make things available. Word, PowerPoint, PDFs, most of the tools that you have available are going to have an automatic checker. Run it. It's like spell check. Run it, right? You know your spelling is perfect. And there's no way that you've got any kind of errors in your document, but you run spell check. Now, one of the most important things is run it, but don't depend on it. A lot of automatic checkers can check for some things, but not for other things. Let's go back to our alt text example. I've got an image in my document, and I run my screen reader check, and it says, hey, it has alt text. But it's not as yet good enough to determine whether that's meaningful alt text. It could be, if it's a Shutterstock image, it could be the Shutterstock file name, right? And that's not going to be meaningful to anybody. So do your automatic checks, because it kind of goes back to that WCAG approach, right? It's not enough, it's not sufficient, but it's necessary. Do your automatic checks because they take a load off of you, but don't rely on them entirely. Follow through and fix stuff yourself. And then finally, when possible, send accessible versions in advance. So down at the bottom of this screen, you will see a website. It says www.microassist.com/accessible-online-training. And if you go to that website, you will find that this presentation, an accessible version of this presentation, is ready for you. You can download it. You can download it right now, and you can be looking at it instead of looking at the Zoom screen. You'll also find, just as a side note, a whole slew of resources that we've collected that we've made available, things like recommendations as to video conferencing tools, recommendations as to how to write good alt text, recommendations as to how to design effective, accessible e-learning. It's a good resource page to have. You send accessible versions in advance so that somebody who needs that accommodation can download them and go through them ahead of time. Maybe they need to go through it as somebody's presenting. Maybe they need to go through it on their own, but use their own tools on their own machine to access it. Maybe they need time to go through it and think about what the content is, so they get the most out of the presentation. Now, I know some of you might be like me. I literally was making changes to this slide till about 10:45 Central Time. Not this slide, but this presentation. And what you will find is that when you download this, there'll be things that are a little bit off. Like it won't have, right now, it's not going to have the location of our of the resource of the accessibility PESO discussion list. Because adding that in, and I think that's okay. I think get as good as you can get, and then make it available, and then go in and update it later. Cut yourself some slack. Let people know, hey, it's not going to be 100% up to date, but it's available there, and you can pull on it. Okay. Now, what about later? What about stunts that we do later? Now, this is where things get really wild and really exciting. Okay, remember, you see the slide. Now, feel free to take a screenshot of it or whatever. Not this slide, actually. The next one's much better. But you also have this available to download from the website that's down at the bottom, accessible-elearning-training, microassist.com. This is our general process for creating, in this case, it's a module of e-learning. And as y'all, those of you who work with e-learning know, those of you who don't work with e-learning, I'll let you know, it's an intensive process, because when you're creating something that's meant to stand alone without an instructor that anybody can take anytime, you got to give a lot of thought into it. And it draws on a whole slew of different skill sets, from subject matter expertise to instructional design to graphic design, multimedia, and programming. So it's a complex process. And this is our general process. So we start with visual design and, what is it going to look like? We do a course a task analysis. What are the goals, objectives, that sort of thing. We create a design blueprint, which kind of sketches out those design. What activities are we going to use to achieve those objectives? A storyboard, which is this is the actual image we want to use. This is the actual text that's going to be on the screen. This is the actual narration that's going to be said, right? And then that gets put into a program module. And then that gets put out, exported, and then it's tested by the target audience or by the alpha and beta testers. You know, so I'm just kind of hitting the high points here. And you'll notice down at the left part of the screen, I have a test for accessibility right next to testing. You test for accessibility at testing. And I tell you, is a difficult place to do this work. So another story. One online course that I was designing, I'm sure many of you like to use red and with text to make, you know, hey, this is important note, or, you know, stop note. Now, you can never use color alone, because people who are colorblind, if you have like press the green button or press the red button, if they're colorblind, they couldn't tell the difference, right? So you put like an on and an off label on it, and then somebody who, you know, you have the color for the impact for those who can see color, and you have the text for those who can't see color. So I use white text on red, and this is one of the early courses that I was working on, and it was throughout the entire thing, and then it got down to testing for accessibility, and you know what? Your standard bright red, white text on your standard bright red does not have sufficient color contrast. There's not enough contrast between the white text and that red so that somebody can easily tell the difference between the text and the background. For me, that was a lot of fun, right? Because I had to go through every instance I used that, I had to replace it with a darker red. Testing for accessibility at the end leaves you open to these things. It's expensive and it's time consuming. If you had sign-offs throughout your project, or you got approvals throughout your project, now, man, you got to get those approvals again. This is kind of what we moved to that proved out to be a lot more successful. Feel free to take a screenshot of this screen, or it's also in the presentation that's available on the website. Design and development, accessible. This is the accessible approach. So we put accessible things where they belong, where they work for us. So if I'm designing visual design, not only am I looking at colors and layout, menus and typography, I'm also doing a color contrast check. I'm making sure that none of my elements like buttons are relying on color alone to convey information. If I'm doing analysis, when I'm doing my course analysis, my task analysis, I'm looking for cognitive strategies. How do I chunk information for those with cognitive disabilities to make it as easy as possible to understand? Design blueprint, this is where I'm paying attention to things like keyboard interactions. Like, I live by my objectives. When I create a course, I've always got objectives. They're meaningful action verbs. That's how I measure things, right? So if I've got my objectives and they're solid, the question to me isn't how do I change those objectives to make it accessible, right? So I can design activities. It's like, what kind of activity can I design that I can manipulate using the keyboard and complete it using the keyboard that still meets the objective. So like, instead of using a drag and drop, which is pretty complicated to use if you don't have a keyboard, to say the least, I might use a series of multiple choice questions, right? My objective is my key, and then I figure out ways to achieve that objective using these techniques. And I'm designing it there. When I'm doing my sketch, I actually literally sketch. I just find this makes it makes it good for me. When I'm designing my sketch, that's when I do it. And so that because you know, if you're at the end of your process, you need to redesign an activity. You can imagine the amount of effort that can take. Storyboards are where I create my alt text, or preferably my subject matter experts, because they know why I'm including that image, right? They write the alt text. I'm looking at language, making sure my language is at the right target level. I'm identifying my heading structure. I'm making sure all my activities have the proper instructions, right? This is what I'm building in at the storyboard level. Program module, there's some things you have to do at the program module. I can identify a heading, like you should have like a heading structure. I should probably mention this, right? You basically want to have a heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, heading 4, structure, everything nested properly, kind of like an outline, so that somebody using a screen reader can jump to the appropriate heading and get that content. Also helps immensely, as you know, because you do this all the time, design visually to make things more effective in terms of cognitive structure. Right? Now I can identify it in the storyboard, but I can't program. That has to be at the program level. Tab order. Make sure tabs go through this. Tab goes through the screen, especially on e-learning interactions, which might have a big whole mess of things, right? I might say how I want the navigation to occur, but it's my programming level that will actually program that navigation. So put things in the right place. And then the beauty of it is that testing does what it's supposed to do. Testing confirms that all criteria are met. It's not to say you're not gonna run into problems. Funny story, so I was working on a course that was talking about plumbing, and we have valves, right? We need to talk about valves in plumbing. Well, valve has a VE at the end. Value has a UE, and they look pretty similar when you're just doing a scan. And here's what kills me. Spell check doesn't distinguish between the two. So as a side effect, this is a side effect when I was doing my screen reader run through, I would hear, and then turn on the plumbing value. And I'm like, what? Right? So not by any means the main point, but like one of those added benefits that can kind of come through. That's the kind of stuff that you'll find when you do accessibility tests. You might find out that a color scheme wasn't correct. Right? Factor that in for the next course you do. You might find out that the tab ordering is incorrect. If you got your main tab ordering structure and your programmer or you knows to program it, easily just could have been, hey, I added this in at the last minute and I didn't think to rearrange the tab order. That's the stuff you should be checking at the accessibility in the confirmation level. So when you're designing for later, this is what I think about. I think about how to structure it. I think about building all of that in. So when I'm recording my videos, my training videos, I have in the very beginning, I'm thinking captioning, I'm thinking audio description, I'm thinking transcript. So if I've got a video going and it's like a software simulation, I'm thinking, can I just have my narrator describe where they're going and what buttons they're clicking and how they're activating this, right? So, because if I can incorporate that, if I have my narrator describe what's going on the screen, I don't have to have a separate audio description. And what's going on the screen is available to everybody. So somebody watching a software demo on their smartphone can hear the names of what you need to click. Instead of trying to zoom in, pause, zoom in, scan, all that kind of good stuff. Okay, so we covered today. We talked a lot about we talked a little bit about what online learning is. We talked about why it needs to be accessible. We talked about what it means to make something accessible. There's automated tools out there. They are a godsend. They're a lifesaver. But never depend entirely on automated tools. We're still working. Go back, use them for what they're helpful for, and then go back and do manual testing to make sure that it's right. Think about and then we talked a little bit about live and later training. Right? Think about accessibility from the beginning. And if we had like one takeaway, like if you shut this webinar down and you just went and remembered only one thing from this entire session, it would have to be two things. Sorry. First thing is making things accessible makes things better for all your learners. Makes it available to all your learners. You're meeting everybody that you need to meet. But the second thing is that you need to build in accessibility from the beginning. Think about it from the beginning. If you use, if you're building a Word document, you're thinking about, okay, how can I put this Word document out on the website? If you're building a web page for training, how do I design that web page so that it makes sense to people? You're thinking about the end audience. You're factoring that in from the beginning. What tools do I have available? If you're thinking about e-learning, I know whenever I think about programming this kind of e-learning in my head, it's when I'm thinking about e-learning, it's I think about the tool that I'm going to be programming it in, so I'm not making a whole lot of trouble for myself. I'm building that in from the beginning. Build accessibility in from the beginning and incorporate it throughout. And it's amazing, just like right now, second nature to create activities for your in-person classes, whether they're virtual or not virtual, right? It becomes second nature to make things accessible so that they're available to all your learners. All right, how is that? We've got 15 minutes left for questions, which quite frankly, I'm surprising myself. because normally I would just keep on going on and on and on. So I'll ask Dallas if you could take a few minutes, maybe take a look at those questions, and then kind of get them ready for me to ask, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Just a couple of notes. I will post any questions that I don't get to today. I'll post them to this website, www.microassist.com/accessible-online-training. You can also reach out to me if you come up with any questions that occur to you after our webinar is finished. You can reach out to me either by phone at 512-794-8440, and a message will get to me and I'll give you a call back. Or you can email me at KGUMIENNY, or Kilo Golf Uniform Mike India Echo November November Yankee. I memorized just that much of the NATO alphabet at microassist.com, and then I will respond. I love talking about this. Please don't be shy if something comes up. I really would enjoy talking with you about any kind of problems that you might be encountering or any questions that you might have. All right. So I see a note from Dallas that we've got some questions in the Q&A. Okay, so there's a couple of, okay, so we have one person who says that they're unable to click on the link in the presentation. And that's true, and that might be because if you're talking, Natalie, if you're talking about the link in the presentation on the downloadable PowerPoint, that's quite likely because I was adding that at the last minute and I forgot to put an actual link on there. So maybe copy and paste that link into a web browser. Of course, if it's the Zoom session, it does function kind of like a video, but I can also just email you the link. That's not a problem. And then Margarita Balderas asks, does what good PowerPoint design you were talking about apply to in-person and webinar training? I think so. I think so. I think anytime you're using a PowerPoint, I think it's to support you as a speaker. I think that the more consideration you can give to your PowerPoint design, the better, the more effective in general your training is going to be. Another person to take a look at that I dearly adore is Nancy Duarte, D-U-A-R-T-E. She has a consulting firm and she's published several books. One's called Slideology, one's called Resonate. And there is a third book that she recently published that's escaping my memory at the moment. But she really kind of goes into this and she talks not just about what makes a good PowerPoint slide, but how to make a good presentation. Like, you know, how to build your presentation, the need to practice your presentation so that when you get out, it becomes much more effective. Okay, so somebody, anonymous, asks, what resources do you suggest to learn more? I work mostly with PowerPoints. So yeah, so I would say Duarte, absolutely, her work on PowerPoints. There are a lot of resources on the webpage, on the accessible-online-training webpage at microassist.com. I kind of direct you there. I personally, Robin Williams has a great book called Designing for Non-Designers. It's in the 3rd or the 4th edition now. It's a very simple kind of approach. And by that, I mean, if like your focus is on creating effective training, right? And you really kind of want to incorporate good design into that, it's a great book that just kind of lines that. If I recall correct, it's basically 4 principles: contrast, repetition. Oh, I'm blanking on A. And then I'm blanking on P. So it'd be great to take a look at Robin Williams and see what she says that acronym needs to stand for. But it's a simple book. It's very quick to read. And that's a great resource. I love talking about, and I love reading about typography, but that's probably just because I'm a type nerd. And I don't know if that would really help you that much. All right, what other questions do we have? Okay, so Dallas, if you could send me a note, and if you have any other questions that we want to talk about. Live caption setting in PowerPoint. Yes, it is, and I would have to. That's something that's going to be So the question is, I'm sorry, can you share more about the live captioning setting in PowerPoint? That's going to probably be best if I post it to the web page, because when I give like technical directions, I like to sit down and write them out. So let me post that there. But basically, if you subscribe, or your organization subscribes to Office 365, there's a setting to turn on automatic live captioning. I turned it on once about a year ago, maybe about half a year ago, and I've never turned it off. And ever since then, every PowerPoint show I do has automatic live captioning. So it's really easy to set up and really easy to use. Do I have any more info? Donna Zaks asks, do I have any more info on accessibility for e-learning? Oh, I thought you would never ask. I love talking about accessibility for e-learning. So, I'm going to direct you back to the website. Got a lot of resources there, but just kind of hit the high ones. If you're working in Storyline, there's a great link there put out by Doug Henderson, I think, over at the University of California's system. And he basically takes you through Storyline. It's Storyline 3, but he sort of takes you through all the technical settings that you do to create accessible e-learning. There's a couple of, Diane Elkins is another person to really kind of keep your eye on. She does a great amount of stuff on both the technical side. What can I do with Captivate to make it more acceptable? Okay. Captivate, how to make that Captivate more accessible. We've got several other items there on the policy level. There's an article that I kind of wrote for TD Magazine a couple of years back that sort of talks about, why do this process if you need to convince people to kind of take you through. So yes, a few people commented on the design and development slide isn't necessarily accessible. It's too dense, the font size is too small, and it's got too much text. I love you guys. Y'all are absolutely right. I've got to take that apart and I've got to rebuild it. What I might say is that one of the advantages of providing you with the PPTX file available on the website is that you can go down there and you can zoom in on it as you need to. You can enlarge the font as you need to. You can go tab through each of the areas as you need to, because I've given you control. You can take that negative of it being too dense, the type not being easy to read, and sort of adjust it to your own preferences so that you can access it more efficiently. All right, we just got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to stick on to the webinar, but I want to just kind of hit a couple of things before we go. Okay, so this is some stuff about Microassist, but the thing I really want to, before we talk about this, I just want to re-emphasize that just thank again y'all for joining us, and thanks us for our for the help that we've gotten from the Texas Department of Information Resources for being an education sponsor, and most importantly, www.dir.texas.gov. Down toward the page, lower left, there's a Stay Connected button on that page. Click on that and you can access the PESO discussion list. It's going to be renamed, as I talked about a little bit earlier, the DIR-accessibility list, but once you just subscribe, you'll be carried over. And like I said, it is a great resource. I'm reading it all the time. It's just a fantastic resource. Not just if you live in Texas and are working with Texas state agencies, but just in terms of accessibility in general. All right. Yes, and Barbara Yaloff, you should be able to access the slide deck on the website, www.microassist.com/accessible-online-training. If you can't, email me at kgumienny there we go. And Dallas just posted a note to tell Barbara that there's going to be a link in the follow-up email, which is going to be even easier. Fantastic. Okay, so I just wanted to hit a couple of things. I've mentioned the website a lot. There's a lot more information there. Any questions, I'll scan through the chat, and anything that wasn't answered during our session today, I'll address that. Please take a minute and give us feedback. The site is http://bit.ly/ma-webinar-survey. That's bit.ly/ma-webinar-survey. This link will also be in the follow-up email, but if you can take a minute and do it right now while it's fresh on your mind, that's going to be such a big help. We read these, we look at what you have to say, we incorporate it so we can do, so we can keep the things that are working and adjust those things that need to be better. So we really value the time. We value the time that you've given us today. Asking an hour out of a busy day, busy schedule, especially in the world today, it's just tremendous. Thank you so much for attending this session. And please, if you can spare just a little bit more time, shouldn't take long to fill out the survey. We'd really appreciate it. I do want to put a plug in also on Microassist newsletters. We got a couple of newsletters. One is reposted to the PESO discussion list, and you'll see that's put out by my colleague, Jack McElhaney. It's called Accessibility in the News. He does this fantastic job where he collects all the scenarios. It's on a weekly basis. So anything to do with accessibility that's published, he compiles it in a newsletter and sends it out every Thursday. Tremendous, great source of information. Really, really valuable. And then we also have a training newsletter. We do in-person training, we do online training, and we also include tips and tricks, how to improve your own efforts, like with Excel or Word, that sort of thing. And you can subscribe to both of these at www.microassist.com/about/newsletter-subscriptions. It's microassist.com/about/newsletter-subscriptions. And then finally, just another note before I close down, just to kind of highlight some of the things that Microassist as an organization does. We're focused on accessibility solutions, audits and testing. If you're curious, if you have e-learning, I'll tell you this, I don't think it came up in the questions, but if you've got existing e-learning, one question that might occur to you is, how do I know if it's accessible? So you can send it to somebody like us, and we'll do an audit and tell you where it works and where it doesn't work. And we'll also kind of give you recommendations on how to address those issues. We'll remediate it if that's what you need, or we'll rebuild it. But here's the thing, you can do it yourself too. So get an idea of what CAG. So you're not testing blindly, but I will tell you the single easiest thing that I've done. The two easiest things I've done. I'm always doing this, aren't I? Here's the one, but no, it's really two. The two easiest things that I've done, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, is that first, run a color contrast. There are tools that are linked on the website, on the webpage. Like color contrast analyzer by the Paciello group. And that's a really easy check. Put in the values of the text, put in the values of the background, see if it meets color contrast ratios. Super easy. The other thing, like as a functional test, see if you can complete the entirety of your training, accessing all the links and activating all the buttons using only the keyboard. Put your mouse aside. Just use the keyboard. That'll give you a really good idea of where you stand on that base level of accessibility. Also, I might add that we, for learning development, we'll develop accessible e-learning. We do curriculum design and development. We do staff augmentation. And I've already mentioned that we do training delivery, virtual instructor-led training, on-demand training, and team training. In fact, we've got we've got a couple of on-demand courses that you can access through our website. One of them is an introduction to accessibility. Really kind of good when somebody is just kind of wondering what this topic is about. And it covers everything from the laws all the way to etiquette related to disability. And then the other course we have is it's an in-depth course that that teaches you how to use Adobe Acrobat Pro to take an inaccessible PDF and create and rebuild it, design it, adjust it so that it is accessible and that it meets WCAG 2.0 standards. All right, very good. Thanks. It's noon, so we'll go ahead and sign off. Thanks again so much for joining us on this discussion. It's meaningful. Making stuff accessible, it means making stuff accessible available to all your learners. And it's the second of the 1 points that I wanted to stress. if you have one takeaway from today, think about accessibility from the very beginning when you sit down to start on your training project, and you'll be amazing how effortlessly it flows. You really will. Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Reach out to me if you have any questions.